Okay, William. So thank you very much for coming again. And without any further introduction, I would just ask you to go ahead. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
This is the first of 4 chapters in this book on education. And I suspect the reason I spent so much time on these is because it's such a crucial element of the ideological change that's been taking place in the Western world over more than 100 years. I'm going to say even 150 years. Kind of at the start, at least in North America, at the start of the whole idea of public education. So I'm going to begin this little talk, and I'm going to have to refer to my book as we go along without actually reading a lot of it. But I want to start with a quote from the Brookings Institution. And maybe I should preface everything I'm saying by the remark that I've studied my chapter again, and if you don't mind the immodesty, I'm kind of shocked at how much information there is in it on this whole mess called education. Really, I was taken aback by it. And the second thing I wanted to say was I can't believe how much I wrote about in this chapter that I suspected at the time was coming down the road, and I was warning people about it, but that's here now. In other words, a lot of the things that were concerning me then as possibilities have come true. So anyway, back to the Brookings Institution. In 1990, they're a very well-known American public policy institution. And I opened the chapter with a quote from them because I think it hits the nail on the head. They said, "We believe that existing educational institutions cannot solve the problems of education because they are the problem." So you can see where this is leading. This particular chapter is about how there's an inherent conflict between the duty of parents and their surrogates, like people they might hire, for example, to teach the core values of a free society, and the notion of, quote, public, unquote, education. For when citizens are compelled to transfer this private duty and their private funds in the form of taxes to public employees of the state, every distinctive value of a free society will eventually be eroded by the counter values inherent in public education. And now this is saying a lot in the first sentence, but I hope to show why this is so as we go and in subsequent chapters. This is not a result that anyone has to plan for. It will arise automatically as a natural consequence of this transfer of the duty from public agents to private agents to public agents. And this despite the very best intentions, which is what most teachers have. Public educators inevitably become contributing partners in a system that, for lots of common sense reasons, tends to create mediocre results. In short, there is little difference between a collectivized command economy and its failures and collectivized command education and its failures. Neither can work well, and the unit cost of the product is very great, about double the cost of the same education rendered privately. The command economies of the world have fallen apart from the inside out. And by the way, this book was published and this chapter was written just before the shocking collapse of the Soviet Union, although maybe it was just after the collapse. I guess that was 1989. But in my book, The Trouble with Canada, I did say that these socialist empires would fall apart from the inside. And then it did. It collapsed. And I discovered that all my leftist friends, and I do have a few still, they thought that when the Berlin Wall came down, all the Germans ran to the east. So they got it pretty messed up. At any rate, let's start by looking at some of the basics like costs. What are the, or were then, 1990, I'm sure there are more now. So anything I say in this chapter, which is dated to 1990 or 1993 when the book was published, you can just assume it's worse now. So after 100 years of public education, here we have spending as a percentage of gross national product in various countries. For example, Sweden, 7.6%. Canada, 7.4%. The US, 5.6%. So as soon as you hear that, you think, oh, gee, the Americans aren't spending as much on education as these other countries. But a nation spending a high percentage of a small GNP may actually be spending, fewer actual dollars on each student than a nation facing the opposite situation. The United States, for example, spends a smaller percentage than many other of GNP than many other nations, but in absolute dollars, it spends the most on every student. At that time, it was about $4,500 US on average. However, here's the surprise, and in this and in subsequent chapters, I'll explain what the surprise is. It turns out that spending figures are a red herring, as we say, because international research has failed to show any positive relationship between spending on education and academic performance. If anything, it shows a highly negative relationship. The more we spend, the worse the results we seem to get. Contrary to common sense, for example, as class sizes fall, standards seem to fall, and money, there are more teachers to pay, seems to camouflage the failure. And now I'll just mention a few international assessments of education. Obviously, most of these focused on my country, Canada, but also the USA and many European nations. So the book is not stale dated. A standardized international test of chemistry and physics, for example, that was carried out in 1990 to the high school students of 10 nations. Here we have Hong Kong, Britain, Singapore, Japan, Hungary, Poland, Sweden, Italy, the US, and Canada. All these nations were surveyed in this international test, and it was carried out by the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, called IEA. They're still around. They're still doing this. It showed that these nations ranged from a high score in chemistry of 77%, that was in Hong Kong, to a low of 37% in Canada, where I am. The United States scored 38%. In physics, Hong Kong again scored the highest with 70%, and Canada second lowest with 40%. The US scored 46%. Italy was the lowest with 28%. In biology and physics, same organization testing, 18-year-olds, more than 95% of the Canadian public high schools examined ranked lower than the lowest school in the best country. This, of course, was a big shock when the book came out, and I got all kinds of flack for exposing these things. Most telling of all, other countries in the study relied on conventional methods of direct instruction of skills and knowledge, quote unquote. Teach, study, test, retest, and so on. Whereas Alberta, which is one of the provinces of Canada, had by then swung to a, quote, person-centered approach of feel-good education derived from the U.S. educator and deeply radical man, I should say, named John Dewey. And there'll be more on this, on John, as we go along, because he was a big troublemaker when it comes to the drift of modern education. In the Globe and Mail newspaper, which is Canada's national newspaper, an education critic asked how such a person-centered philosophy, quote, reflects the character of North American capitalism. The point, of course, is that it doesn't. It reflects the egalitarian educational goals prevalent in all our schools. And by the way, at the time, there was quite a marked difference between the way private schools were carrying on with respect to these ideological changes and the way public schools were carrying on. But I have to say, 30 years later, right now, it's no longer the case in most of them. It still is in some. For example, private schools with a religious basis tend to resist the kinds of ideological changes that we're going to be looking at here. We're just starting. But it's interesting, some of the more expensive private schools, I'm talking about high schools now and lower schools, and it's quite shocking. There's one not far from me where my kids went. And at the time, many years ago, it was kind of, your basic good private school. Lots of schooling, lots of homework, lots of sports, a great place for them to be educated. Right now, it's like a mini university. I guess the area's gotten a lot wealthier and people have been pouring money into it, donations and so on. There's a new building going up every year. It's like a university campus. And unfortunately, you see the odd 16-year-old driving around with a brand new BMW that his dad gave him for his birthday, or maybe for like actually graduating from grade 10 or something. I don't know. It's the kind of thing you never saw when I was in high school. Back then, you were expected to graduate. We never got a diploma. We never even got a pat on the back. What you did get was a lot of flack and criticism if you didn't graduate. It's very different today. As I say, these schools have become, some of the private schools, and I will be talking more about how privatizing public education is probably the only solution we're ever going to see to this problem. And that's a tough one because it's so highly unionized, at least in North America. So anyway, where we are definite winners, I should say, in the education game is in the race for the least amount of time spent on homework, the most hours spent watching television, the highest illiteracy rates, and the most money spent on education, quote unquote, and other such non-academic measures. Only 72% of Canadians at age 17 are still enrolled in some form of formal education or apprenticeship, compared, say, with 94% in Japan and 89% in West Germany. As I say, these are old figures, but I think they're probably still the same, if not better, and for them, and maybe worse for us. Here's some more shocking stuff. The United States at that point had a functional literacy rate of 80%, Canada 76%, Japan 98%, and South Korea 100%. And the last, Korea that is, South Korea, with average class sizes in urban areas of 55 students per class. You're all pretty familiar, I guess, with the old complaint from teachers. Well, we need to get the class sizes down. It's hard to teach that many kids. Well, the South Koreans don't seem to have any problem. And, I'm an old man now, but when I was a young boy going to school, we had about 45 kids in our, grade 6 class. And the teachers had no problem with it.
William, did you say 55 in Korea, South Korea?
55 students per class.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and here we are today talking about 20, 21, 22, and arguing that that's the norm. Well, we'll get to the impact of that kind of argument in a moment, which has to do with cost of education, of course. In 1990, this is a shock, 700,000 U.S. high school graduates, in other words, they actually graduated and got a diploma, could not read their own diploma. I got that from a magazine called Conservative Chronicle, which I think was a reliable investigator. And the same number, 700,000 U.S. students, dropped out of high school, so they had no diplomas to read, even if they could. The Canadian dropout rate at the time was about 30%, one of the very worst amongst developed nations. It's a catastrophe, or was, in the province of Quebec, where 42% of Quebec males dropped out. The overall U.S. rate at the time was 25%. Japan was 29% in 1965, but by 1990 was only 2%. So whatever it was they did, they managed to keep those students in school. Sweden fell from 25% in 1985 to 15% today. That's 1990. As for spending, everywhere we see inverse relationships between academic success and the money spent. Higher and higher pay for teachers, lower and lower numbers of students taught per teacher, and worsening academic performances. The crisis is such in the United States, it was then, it's worse now, I think, that even, and by the way, there's an interesting connection between all this and democracy. You know, political democracy, especially when it mutates. I'm using the word mutate because it doesn't evolve. Evolve suggests an improvement. Mutation is just a change. And then the argument is, what caused the change? But as I say, there's an interesting connection between democracy and democratic theory and this lowering of academic standards brought about by the switch from the foundation of liberty, which implies merit. If you have individual liberty, you've got to go to the merit principle in everything you do, not like today's woke business of, you know, equality, diversity, they say equity, which is a bad term. And when they mean equality, they mean forced equality, diversity, and inclusion. See, well, how do you include everybody when they're just plain stupid or plain lazy, you know, don't want to do any homework? Well, you lower the standards. You lower the academic standards. So kids, the dumb kids end up being able to pass a dirt easy exam, and the bright kids are bored silly and they're yawning all the way through it, you know, because the merit principle has to go in any egalitarian democracy, but not in the classical liberal democracy where liberty, individual responsibility were still the main theories of underpinning the whole system. There was a man named Al Shanker. He was the president of the American Teachers Federation. And now, if you want to see a powerful union, you just go look up the American Teachers Federation. But this is true, I would say, in all the modern democracies. The teachers' unions are incredibly powerful. No political party wants to offend them. They're all sucking up to them to get their votes, and so they give them what they want. But Al Shanker, he must have been resigning that year, or he would have been fired. He said that 90 to 95% of American students who go to college would not be accepted in any college anywhere else in the world. That's a huge number. And for him to say that, 90 to 95%, but even if we cut it in half or by 2/3, it's a disgrace. And he said, quote, "We spend half of our money on educational bureaucracy, whereas the other schools in the world don't spend more than 20%. And we have one teacher for every 25 kids, but one supervisor for every 6 teachers." Well, you can see how this sort of Ponzi scheme has developed. The economist Thomas Soule, you probably all know who he is. He's just a wonderful fellow. He's an older man now too, but he was kind of adopted by Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago in the economics program, and became an incredibly successful. He's a beautiful writer and thinker, and became a very influential force in the conservative movement. But as a black intellectual, I can tell you, because I communicated with him and sent him a couple of books, which he sent me a couple of his, he's been picketed most of his life. By who? By blacks. Black liberals picketing him for telling the truth. In every book that he wrote, it's just full of truth. And of course, what they were doing way back then was what we now call deplatforming the poor fellow. If you want to see interesting interviews with him, you can go to YouTube and look up Firing Line, which was a program that lasted for 35 years in which William F. Buckley, Jr., another brilliant man and very influential conservative, he had a couple of interviews with Thomas Soule, and I think you'd enjoy them. Anyway, Soule estimated that 1/3 of the U.S. money that trickles down to the schools goes for psychologists and counselors alone. Believe me, it's a shocking number, and Soule would not have said that unless he could prove it, because if anything is true of his writing, it's that he backed everything up with incredibly good facts and research. And he underlined the embarrassing finding that what's called the SAT, or the Scholastic Achievement Test, I don't know about over there where you folks are, but the SAT is widely used in North America as a kind of filtering device to admit students to universities. And the results of millions of students who take that test over the years, it turns out that the scores on those tests are lower today, Soule says, than they were 30 years ago. So he's comparing 1990 to 1960. I'm just presuming that has continued. I don't want to write another book to find out, but my bet is, dollars to donuts, is that that's the case. And he says that the vocabulary of the average student today, in 1990 that is, contains half as many words as in 1945. I mean, you don't have to be an academic to be shocked about that. The American Bombshell Report on Education was called A Nation at Risk. They got concerned about what this meant in their democracy. And it said that the average achievement of students graduating from college in 1983 was lower than 15 years prior, and that for the first time in U.S. history, I'm quoting now, the educated skills of one generation will not surpass, will not even equal, will not even approach those of their parents, unquote. Sobering stuff. In 1991, Canada was spending about $7,400 Canadian for a secondary student or high school student. And at the time, that about matched the cost for a good private day school. As I say, people think that all private schools are for the wealthy, but there's a ton of private schools in Canada and elsewhere, which are pretty ordinary schools. And they have to pay for their buildings and for their, property taxes and all the rest of it because they're private schools. Whereas public schools get exempted from taxes. They don't have all sorts of costs to count in their per student cost. The private schools do. And yet still, these ordinary private schools come out, student education costs less than in a public school. Okay, so here's another shocking insight. Our students, North American students now, are working less and less. Japanese students spend 243 days in school every year. West Germans, 240. South Koreans, 220. Israelis, 216. Hong Kongers, 195. And Ontarians, where I live, 185. And Quebecers and Americans, 180 days in school. But students in many other nations also spend longer in school each week than do our students. In other words, bigger part of each day. A rough calculation of their weekly hours spent in class, minus recess and lunch break and all that stuff, times the extra weeks per year, tells us that they attend classes 9 more weeks per year, times 12 years, which is 108 weeks, or 756 days, or 4 years more schooling at the 185 days per year rate than others do. And I think that's probably why major universities of the world give, for example, the French baccalaureate and the British A-level high school students advanced placement, because they are advanced over ours. And that goes for a lot of other countries too. So there's a Canadian whom I happen to know. He's an economics professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. who did a major study of education because he was very worried about where it was going to. And he said that a lot of things, but I'm just giving you a few. Since 1960, he said, the ratio of students to teachers in public schools has fallen steadily by a total of almost 30%. So back in the day, it was 26 students per teacher in 1960, but it was 18.3 in 1985. The United States paralleled this trend almost exactly. And this change in the teacher-student ratio has boosted education costs by 25% in real terms. The U.S. figure, listen to this, was 37 students per teacher in the year 1900. It's hard to get this information, by the way. I do a lot of digging, especially the older stuff. But again, current studies show no relationship between class size and performance, although this reasoning is used widely to secure more teachers and more funding. Now, how is it so that some of the best research, all the best research, tells us that there's no connection? And yet that's the argument they use to get more money and hire more teachers. Canadian teachers, for example, earned about 80% of the manufacturing wage in 1950, reached parity in 1960, and by 1990 earned roughly 50% more than the basic manufacturing wage. So if you track all those things, the wage for teachers has gone way up, or up, rising at a faster rate than other sectors. Now I'm just going to turn the screen a bit because the sun is shining in my face. So it makes me look like I have two faces. So now I want to talk about illiteracy, which is a big deal. There was a study published called Broken Words in my country, Why 5 Million Canadians Are Illiterate. And I think you could probably duplicate this study in a lot of the modern democracies. It was a $300,000 report on literacy. It said, I can still hardly believe this, but this is what they found out. 24% of Canadian residents 18 and older are illiterate in either official language. Now, Canada has two official languages, thanks to Prime Minister Trudeau, the father of our present Prime Minister, French and English. But in either of those languages, 24% illiteracy. And interestingly, the illiteracy, our country's 7,000 miles wide, or kilometers, I don't know, but it increases from west to east, from a low of 17% in the far west, British Columbia, to an astonishing 44% in the province of Newfoundland. More than half of 4.5 million illiterates, which is what the study was getting at, who could not do the tasks we're talking about here, said they went to high school. And 1/3 said they had finished grade 12, which is our highest year of high school year. Used to be grade 13 when I was a kid. Then it went to grade 12. About 1 million of the 4.5 million illiterates are immigrants. And the illiteracy rate, quote, has risen sharply among immigrants since 1980. It is very high among multilingual groups, 49% for the foreign-born and 33% for the Canadian-born. Immigrants also account for 1/3 of Ontario's literates. That's the province I live in, but almost none of Quebec's. And this is because Quebecers have been able to control the kinds of immigrants that they want to accept in their province. Quebec has all sorts of special deals with the Canadian federal government. And the reason they're able to get those is because they vote as a bloc. So in any election, at 23, well, back then, 25% of the Canadian population, they could threaten whatever political power was trying to get, party was trying to get into power, basically by suggesting that you don't give us that and we're not going to vote for you. And it's interesting, very interesting actually, because a great number of the things that the province of Quebec has managed to get through this kinds of voting leverage are actually reflective of our original Constitution, as it was before Pierre Trudeau came along and changed the whole thing by dumping what we call our Charter of Rights and Freedoms on top of it, which tended to throw the legitimacy of government to the courts and took it away from Parliament. But Quebec didn't want to be pushed around by the socialism of other Canadians. They wanted their own socialism. And so they used their voting leverage to get what they wanted, namely provincial socialism.
William,
Yeah.
you said that in Quebec they had a different policy of immigration. In what way it was different from the rest of Canada?
Well, they can search out and attract immigrants who are coming from French cultures around the world, French islands in the Caribbean, from France itself. They can insist on fluency in the French language, or you don't get in. That sort of thing. So they tended to steer away from, at the time at least, from immigrants who were incompatible with French culture, which I guess is why they had less illiteracy from their immigrants. It was probably just the same as with the native-born French Canadians. May have a few problems, but after all, it has surely produced higher literacy rates than the family-based local and private school system of the 19th century, no? I mean, wouldn't you think so? It turns out there are no reliable figures for Canada. And if there are, by the way, Canada finds a way to hide them. It hid a lot of things for me when I was doing this book. And I'll come back to this issue here. But for example, I asked our own Ministry of Education, what are the dropout rates, the literacy rates, and academic success rates of private school students in Canada compared to public school students? Sorry, sir, we don't survey private schools. We don't have those figures. Well, I believe they do have those figures, but they're frightened to publish them because it makes public education and the public unions, teachers' unions, look so bad. At any rate, back to literacy in the 19th century, I did find some figures in some good, reliable publications for the northern part of the U.S., which is pretty similar to Canada in its demographic. So I say there are no reliable figures for Canada, but a comparison of literacy rates in the United States before and after 1840, that's 1840, not 1940. 1840 is the date that the schools went public, is nothing short of astounding. It turns out that the populated northern half of the United States, which, as I say, is comparable sociologically to Canada, as well as all of New England, all the New England states, had a literacy rate between 91 and 97% by 1840. And that rate has fallen ever since. I mean, if that doesn't throw cold water on the whole system, I don't know what would. And now we come to dropouts, students who simply do not finish school. A Goldfarb study carried out by another institute in Canada that 40% of dropouts in Canada live in single-parent households. That's a lot when you think that the single-parent households at the time were about 12% of the total. James Coleman of the University of Chicago reported that same trend for the U.S., blaming much of the decline in academic achievement on the breakdown of the nuclear family and the rise of the two-income household and the consequent disciplinary problems in the classroom. I did find out, I can't remember where now, but by comparison, most private schools in Canada and the U.S., only a few of which, as I say, were and are elite, graduate about 95% of their students and send the majority of their graduates to the universities of their choice. I'll talk more about this at the end of the chapter, where I will be looking at private schools for the poor that work. And this has been tried and to be proven very successful. And if you think maybe it's gotten really resisted by teachers' unions, you would be bang on, because they can't stand the idea of the privatization of public schools. The theory I came to in my book, and I have the last of these 4 chapters, is on this issue. The theory I came to was that the reason, well, one of the main reasons that public schools do so poorly, and by the way, when people say to me, we got a real education problem in this country, they just stop in their tracks. When I say, no, we don't, they say, what do you mean? I say, we don't have an education problem. We have a public education problem. The private schools, with no ministries of education for most of their lives, no government involvement whatsoever, have been turning out the most wonderful young men and women for a century and a half. So we don't have education problems in private schools, whether they're the expensive private schools or the very most baseline, small neighborhood private schools. We do not have these problems that you are talking about. I mean, if that doesn't shock them into rethinking this, I don't know. But back to my main point. The conclusion I came to, why public schooling can never work, it's doomed to fail, is because the paymaster of the teacher is the government. And the reason private schools tend to be generally very successful, I mean, sure, there's some bad ones, some whatever, but most of them are very successful, is because the paymaster of the teachers is the parents of the children. Who cares most about the children and what education they're getting? Well, the parents, not the government. The government's just a damn bureaucracy holding itself together and dictating what the curriculum ought to be. So this is the secret key to the failure of public education. If you want to change that, you've got to change the paymaster, which is what I get to in the last chapter, how to do that. What are the reasons this huge percentage of kids has dropped out? Well, about 29% say they need to work. I can't say much about that because maybe it's true. Want to work and need to work are quite different, but maybe someone are supporting families or parents or whatever. 19% of the dropouts simply give personal reasons which are not revealed. And about 14% are female dropouts who say they are pregnant. In a book called The Good School, the author gave the percentage of students within each ethnic group who are enrolled in university-bound courses, meaning they're not taking what we call the basket weaving courses, finger painting and all that. They're taking the serious stuff. And by the way, if you want to talk about, and I'll get to this, I guess, I don't know, later in this book, if you have the patience to stay with it. And a doctor told me this some years ago when he was operating on my shoulder. He said, William, he said, the Robarts Library at the University of Toronto, it's a huge, terrific library down in downtown Toronto, part of the University of Toronto facilities. He said, if you go to the Robarts Library at 9 or 10 o'clock on a Friday night, he said, you won't see any Caucasians. You'll see only Asian students and Jewish students. No Caucasians there on Friday night. In other words, they've all got their heads down studying these university-bound courses. But that was a shocking thing for me to hear from him, and it made me feel sorry for my own people. I'm Caucasian, obviously, and it made me feel sorry for my own people who can't see the writing on the wall. They're getting bumped out of jobs in hospitals, bumped out of medical schools, bumped out of all sorts of things because they're not willing to do the work. This was underlined for my wife and I when we were our kids were in another school, also a private school, by the way. It happened to be a religious school called Holy Trinity School, not far from us. And my wife was in the school one day, and I think she saw this, or at least she reported it. This Chinese woman came storming into the school, right into the principal's office, and gave him a piece of her mind in no uncertain terms. She said, basically, she said, you're giving my kid too much sports, too much recreational activity, and not enough homework. I want so much homework for him every day that he can't finish it. That's what I want. Forget the sports, forget the extracurricular stuff and the drama and the pottery classes and all the rest of it. Well, of course, that was flying right in the face of certain educational philosophies which have taken hold in the West. The only point I was trying to make by sharing it with you is that that kid was probably one of the kids who ended up at Rubart's library at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. You know, parents were in charge, not the government. So here's some of the ethnic groups in Canada, at least. The percent of students within each ethnic group who are enrolled in these courses. Korean, 93% of them are enrolled in things like, you know, engineering, physics, chemistry, biology, whatever. Jewish, 92%. Chinese, 89%. East Indian, 79%. Greek, 78%. English, 77%. You can see it coming down. Polish, 77%. Indo-Chinese, 73%. Italian, 62%. Spanish, 62%. Caribbean, 53%. And Portuguese, 51%. So all the way from almost 100% to 51% of people in these various ethnic groups.
Does it say anything about black people or Mexicans?
Well, I guess that's what it means by Caribbean. In the day, the word black was coming into vogue, but you know, when I was a student, you talked about a Negro. You didn't talk about a black person. If you called a Negro a black, you get a punch in the face. It was considered a pejorative term. Anyway, in the literature I was quoting, they called everyone from the islands, and a lot of black people in North America come from the Caribbean, 53%. I guess there might have been a category for American blacks who were non-Caribbean, but I didn't see that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, instead of quality education, we're getting intellectual mediocrity. We're getting more guns and knives at school, more teachers beaten up, more drugs, more alcohol, more illiteracy and pregnancy and innumeracy. You know, the people ought to be screaming about, listen to this, about 135 U.S. students. I mean, this is 1990. 135,000 U.S. students take a gun to school every day. That's an American Medical Association report called Code Blue. Code Blue is a term they use in the hospitals when there's an emergency, but this was an educational book called Code Blue in which this figure was cited. The Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, says that 1 in 5 U.S. students carries a weapon, and 1 in 80, it's a gun, other than, say, a knife or brass knuckles or whatever. High school gangs are booming in Canada, too. Violence by youth went up 34% in the 4 years ending in 1990. 8 Toronto students, 14 to 17 years, were recently arrested for having what the press called, quote, an array of powerful weapons, unquote, including an Uzi submachine guns, well, plural, and 357 Magnums. That was quoted in our biggest newspaper, the Toronto Star. Vancouver's 16 high schools have 13 uniformed police officers assigned to them full time. Other Canadian schools are following this U.S.-inspired trend. Teachers at some Ontario high schools, as I say where I live, are now using what they call panic buttons, which alert security guards when teachers are attacked by students. So the long and short of it, this brings me to a quote by Mark Twain. You may have heard, but I like it. He said, I received public schooling as a child, but I never let it interfere with my education. Anyway, it's funny.
It's a good one. William, are you familiar with the work of John Taylor Gatto?
I think so, but not very. I think I probably read a few things, but no. Maybe send me. Yeah.
He has an incredible video lecture. It's called The History of American Education. And he also have a few books. One is Dumbing Us Down and Weapons of Mass Instruction and the Underground History of American Education. It's really incredible. And he was like the best teacher of New York 3 years in a row, stuff like that. Very interesting, man.
Please send me the reference. None of it's going to surprise me, but I'd like to see it.
Okay.
Yeah. The fact is that the public school has often served, well, here we go. A Yale historian named John Dewey has aptly argued that the school, and now I'm getting into the political aspect here, getting away from the facts and figures a little bit, is one of the institutions responsible for what he called the long-term erosion of function of the family. And Stanford's Kingsley Davis wrote that, quote, one of the main functions of the school system appears to be to alienate offspring from their parents. I would say it's more than appears to be. As you'll see as we go through this, it's manifest. The fact is that the public school has often served as a powerful instrument for the counter-socialization of the nation's children. And why not? If you were a radical intent on changing our society, on weakening the structure of the private family, and on replacing all private values we hold dear with public collectivist ones, there would be no better way to begin than by altering the teaching in the schools and writing influential radical textbooks on education. In this respect, radicals have a clear advantage over teachers who see their primary duty as the transmission of the skills and knowledge central to civilization. And that is because radicals don't care about skills and knowledge, nor do they care about civilization, at least of the traditional sort. They care mostly about social transformation. They plan for radical social change in their sleep, and they often see the basics of education as a symbol of a wicked reality that they want to alter. Basic courses in history are for them expressions of Western capitalist exploitation. The nuclear family model is biased against women. According to their various theories, objective knowledge is likely warped by the exploiters or the capitalists, or you name it, and it is therefore secondary to their purpose of realigning society to their point of view. Most often, this is an egalitarian one requiring coercive public powers. So you see the collectivists are at work again through the schools. Now I get to some of the reasons why this is so. From the late 18th century on, especially after Rousseau. By the way, Rousseau wrote a book that became very famous and very influential in the field of education called Emile. I actually just finished reading it again last week before doing the show because I wanted to refresh my mind on what he was getting at. The book is about imaginary child named Emile that Rousseau is counseling us, like, how to raise him from infancy on, right from birth until he's ready to marry and so on. And the main theme, I would say, throughout his book is that education should be natural. It should not be forced. You never do anything. You never force education on a child. Things like memory work are kind of quasi-totalitarian if the kid actually doesn't want to remember it. In other words, he wrote the original book. This is in the mid-18th century, and the book went off like wildfire around Europe and in America. It was probably the first book promoting what they call child-centered or student-centered education, which has basically taken over all through the Western world. And we only find it resisted in certain traditional, usually religious-based schools. 5 of my grandchildren are in one of those right now. And, they sent me a little video of themselves the other night in which they recited from memory some beautiful poetry. And one of them was reciting some wonderful pieces from one of Paul's letters, which they had memorized. And, this is the first time I can recall any of my 16 grandchildren actually reciting something to me that they had committed to memory. Why? Because this is discouraged in the schools as authoritarian. You're just asking the kid to be a robot. Of course, they don't get it. What you're really giving the child when you ask him to memorize something, especially something meaningful and beautiful, is you're giving him a gift. It's a gift of your culture and your civilization and a gift of time. Why, when my father was 75 and we had our last family reunion, he stood up before everybody in the family. There must have been 70 people there. And he recited sonnets from Shakespeare and about a 5-minute piece from the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson that he has never read since high school. He just had committed it to memory, and he loved it and he cherished it. And it was actually something that radiated to the whole crowd. We could see the beauty that he felt in not only in reciting it, but in being able very proudly to recite it. So it's not that we're dumping something into the heads of children. As authoritarians, we're sharing a great gift of our culture with them that they will carry with them all their lives. So I hope someday that will come back. But anyway, Rousseau was mainly the first one responsible in the Western world for this idea that we shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. It was he who argued, like Plato, by the way, and we talked about Plato in my first session, that man's chains were forged of his local patriotisms and authorities, and that this inevitably leads to strife and social decay. His idea was that we're all born free and we're all born good, and it's the rottenness of society that corrupts us. So let's change society. And that's why he wrote another famous book called The Social Contract some years later. Robert Nisbet, who was a wonderful scholar, if you're interested in a great read, he wrote a book. He wrote a book. What's the name of the book? The Search for Community, I think, is the title of the book. And he said about Rousseau that for Rousseau, I'm quoting, even the family must be destroyed, for it is, of all groups lying between man and the state, the most recalcitrant when the state seeks to fuse itself with the individual consciousness. Boy, what language, when the state seeks to fuse itself with the individual consciousness. You know, Nisbet was, and I learned a lot from him, he was pointing to one of the themes that I outline in all my books, this tendency, this mutation in the West from common good conservatism, which is how we started centuries ago, to what I call hyper-individualism and hyper-democracy today, where we think it's only the individual that matters. And we rest a lot of that thinking on the dictum of John Stuart Mill and his libertarian philosophy of the harm principle. You can do whatever you want as long as you don't harm someone else. You know, that sort of idea. That is such an impoverished ideal for human society, it's hard to believe, because it says nothing about the common good of the whole culture, and it says nothing. It says only nothing about future evil, just the immediate evil that you may causing to some other individual. You know, so very short-sighted. Nisbet is the antidote. At any rate, the heart of the modern worldwide struggle, and it is at least worldwide throughout the Western world, between the conservative and the modern liberal instinct, and I say modern because they're not classical anymore, can be summed up as follows. The conservative cherishes the smaller local attachments and affections as the crucial element in the forging of human community, and he sees the state as inimical to their survival. The modern liberal, and the socialist in particular, in contrast, sees such attachments as agents of social degeneration through interfamily competition and the resulting material inequities, you know, rich and poor and all that. For faith, he wants to substitute reason, his kind of reason. For material differences, equality, forced equality. For an inherited moral tradition, utopian ideals. Needless to say, whichever of these two views permeates the schools, it plays a crucial role in determining how our children are going to see the world. Okay, maybe now I should, by the way, after Rousseau, we get the influence of Karl Marx. We talked about that before in his Communist Manifesto, which is a very short book, actually. He talks about the need for the abolition of the family. And his student, Friedrich Engels, of course, wrote a whole book about this, about the abolition of the family. Very early in this century, Stanford University professor Richard Lapierre argued that state-run free public schools, of course, they're not free, they're prepaid through the tax system. Free public schools would, in a generation or two, be the cure for every recognized social ill. He argued that society would break even financially on this arrangement because, thanks to the public schools, young men and women, students, would grow up to be so reasonable and mature that prisons, jails, poor farms, and homes for the indigent would be entirely eliminated. When you think about what he was thinking, this is the early part of the last century, that this is what the public school should be achieving in his mind. At any rate, many of these early socialists never really believed that a Marxist or a socialist workers' revolution would come to pass in the West. As a result of our strong British-derived love of individual freedom, our workers, to the great embarrassment of Marxist theory, were becoming increasingly wealthy and anti-communist. When former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev visited America, I remember watching it on TV, it was U.S. workers who demonstrated and protested against him. The guy was totally shocked. This was the working class, marching up and down with signs, down with communism. Well, it's a very different world we live in. I remember when my ex-father-in-law, he was a Frenchman, came to Canada, and we drove by a construction site one day, and he saw all these cars along the street lined up, kind of modest cars. These were not, BMWs or Porsches or whatever, but they were nice cars, all up and down the street. He said, "This is a work site. Who do those cars belong to?" And I said, "The workmen." And he started to laugh. And I said, "What are you laughing at?" "Oh," he said, "in France," he said, "a workman can't afford a car. The boss has to take him to the work site in a bus." So you see, what was happening is the increasing wealth of workers in North America, at least, they began to see that communism was not the way to go. At any rate, Khrushchev got upset about this, and you may remember it. If you don't, you should go to YouTube and watch it. He stood up at the UN and he pounded his shoe on the table and said that communism, his words, "we will bury you," he said. And now his followers, I said in 1990, his followers have no shoes at all. At any rate, because a revolution from the bottom would never work in North America, our dreamlanders wanted instead to impose it from the top through the gradualism that Gramsci was writing about of infiltrating the institutions. The British Fabian Society, for example, it was named after the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus. He was famous because he beat a lot of his enemies by never actually confronting them. He just kept harassing them, poking at them, little skirmishes and attacks from the side and from the rear that wore them down. So eventually he could beat them, but he never actually got into a full-on, let's charge them kind of battle. And so this society, which was established in 1884 in England, was called the Fabian Society. Well, that's interesting, don't you think? And their idea, I'm using their word, was to permeate the institutions of society, such as the schools, with their ideas, thus achieving a silent social transformation unperceived by the ordinary citizen. In 1905, this society opened a branch in America, and it called itself, you get it, this is, friendly language, it called itself the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. John Dewey was one of the founders, and after changing its name to the League for Industrial Democracy in 1921, Dewey became its president. Its stated purpose was, get this, quote, education for a new social order based on production for use and not for profit, unquote. Some of you listeners may not know that this is one of the main theoretical distinctions of so-called Marxist theory, which is not really a theory, it's a speculation. As I say, Marxism has no theory of wealth creation. It mostly has theories of wealth distribution. At any rate, one of their main theoretical distinctions is between what they call usage value and, means value, like making money for profit, selling things, as opposed to just using them. You know, you buy a plow, you use it, it's sold to you for its usage value. You buy a whole bunch of other things so you can resell them, mark them up and resell them and make money. That's a very different kind of value. And Marx was concerned that the whole Western world, the whole world itself actually, was becoming, the usage value was falling away. So anyway, Dewey was already into Marxist thinking, socialist thinking, and he was a terribly boring writer, but he was smart. He just kept doing the Fabian thing, nibbling away at these institutions. You know, they hope to eliminate all greed-mongering, not their words, they're mine, all greed-mongering capitalist pigs. As we know, however, this is my words, this process instead replaces them with power-mongering socialist pigs who hold absolute control over their people in a form of dreadful bondage. Better to have pigs whose products we can refuse to buy than pigs with machine guns, was my conclusion. At any rate, Dewey's League, his industrial league thing, eventually became the sponsor and the heavy-duty fundraiser for the radical group named Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. When I was at Stanford in the 60s, SDS was very much a feature on the campus, you know, marching around with their flags. And that friend of mine I told you about, he wasn't a friend for long, who stole the steak from the grocery store on the reasoning that capitalism had been stealing from him and his family for generations. I'm just getting even, he said. So at any rate, Students for a Democratic Society ran amok over U.S. campuses in the late 60s. Few were aware that by democratic society, they meant social democracy. Now, I have argued in my own work that this is a contradiction. You can't have a socialist democracy because socialism implies top-down control and democracy implies bottom-up freedom. You put those things together and actually you end up with what I have described to this group as libertarian socialism, where the body politic has been divided into two bodies, a private body and a public body. And that's how we resolve this contradiction. But the students at SDS, including the guy who stole the steak, never got it. Dewey taught that there is no God. He was one of the sponsors of the so-called Humanist Manifesto of 1933, which I'm going to get to in our next talk. We need to spend a little bit of time with that because a lot of very big people were co-signers of that Humanist Manifesto. So there is no God. Man is merely a biological entity and a product of evolution. Now, in his words, there is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there's no need for the props of traditional religion. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent absolutes. By the way, I'm advertising now. One of the reasons I got around to writing a book called The Book of Absolutes, which I encourage your members and listeners to go find, I think it's a terrific book, was I wanted to prove that that's not the case. In fact, that for the most part, human thinking itself, and certainly human science, cannot exist without absolutes. You know, absolutes like the law of gravity and so on. Well, they're all through science. They're all through all sorts of human enterprises. And the Book of Absolutes is about that. End of advertisement. The schools, Dewey insisted, must, quote, take an active part in determining the social order of the future. As teachers align themselves with the newer forces making for social control of economic forces. This is an education guy talking this way, not an economist or, the guy had never even run like a corner store. And often when I get people complaining to me about the profit motive, I say, well, let's have a little discussion. And they say, about what? I say, well, let's say, do you own a home? Yeah, I own a home. So let's say I was able to tell you that 1 mile below the ground in your backyard, there's a whole bunch of gold, and it's worth $10 million. But that it's going to cost you $11 million to bring it up to the surface. Would you dig it up? What for? That would be stupid. I'd lose $1 million. Yeah, of course. I say, what about if it cost you $500,000? Would you bring it up? Well, you're getting closer, but market forces dropping the value of gold. I don't know. I said, what about if you broke even? You bring your 10 million up, cost you 10 million, whatever. And you know what he says now? He says, well, how about hidden cost? I mean, my equipment and depreciation and breakdown and stuff like that. I have to buy new trucks and drills and drill bits. And no, I actually wouldn't even do it if I was break even. I said, but if I told you that after your costs, I could guarantee you $1 million, 10% profit on the 10 million, would you do it? He says, yeah. I said, well, there's your profit motive. And you're just a neighbor. You're just a guy down the street. You're not even a filthy capitalist business. You're just a human being with common sense. And so what he actually realized from our little discussion there was that nobody does anything at an intentional loss. And it's hard to find a reason why anyone would do that unless it's for tax reasons or something like that. But even then, they probably get caught for tax evasion. At any rate, all this agitation about capitalism. And by the way, again, I tell your listeners, capitalism is a bad term. I reject it. And I tell everybody I know, do not use the word capitalism. Why? Because everybody uses capital, especially governments. They're the biggest users of capital in the entire world. It's just that they haven't earned it. Most capitalists have. The glory of our system is not capitalism. It's free enterprise. You see, it's the idea that we are free and we are enterprising and we can make a reasonable amount of money and take the risks of losing it if we exercise our instincts with free enterprise. So capitalism is just a slur term. As I say, rejected. Anyway, here's this Dewey guy who thought the Soviet Union was the dream society. So he went over there. In fact, I always say it was the largest prison camp in history. But he traveled there goggle-eyed with his friends. Who were they? Bertrand Russell. And you know who Bertrand Russell was. I mean, great mathematician and not a bad philosopher. Although I don't think he ever wrote much that was original in philosophy. And Harold Lasky, he was the socialist guru of the London School of Economics, whom our own Pierre Trudeau in my country, another Fabian-style thinker, later held up as the most important intellectual influence in his own political thinking, his words. Each of these became successful. Dewey in turning the U.S. and Canadian schools progressive. Terrible word, progressive. Lasky in working for a so-called New International Economic Order, which, for short is called the NIO, along socialist lines. And Trudeau in doing what he called, his words, I'm quoting, planting socialism in every province of Canada, which is what he set out to do. His reasoning was that because Canada was a federation already, originally he thought it's going to be tough. The whole federation was set up against central control, which I think we need, he says. But then he started to say, you know what, it might be easier because they already have their own provincial constitutions, and I can kind of use one against the other and convert them gradually to a socialist program. So that's basically what he was after. Dewey's chief acolyte at Columbia University, And by the way, Columbia University was the big force and the big driver in this whole education thing, leftist teachers college. In fact, the copy of the book on Emile by Rousseau that I just finished last week, I just looked at who the publisher was Columbia University Teachers College. They published it. Well, wouldn't you know? Because that's exactly what they want to see in force all around the world. But Dewey's chief acolyte at Columbia was a man named George Counts. And he wrote a book called Dare the Schools Build a New Social Order? ? You see, it wasn't about education. It was about social engineering. That was written in 1932. Think about it, 100 years ago. He wrote that, quote, the school should be regarded as an agency for the abolition of all artificial social distinctions and for organizing the energies of the nation for the promotion of the general welfare, unquote. His words. All this, he said, quoting again, applies quite as strictly to the nursery, the kindergarten, and the elementary school as to the secondary school and the university, unquote. You will say, he wrote, I'm quoting again, that I am flirting with indoctrination. Really? And my answer is again, in the affirmative. I am. Well, the one thing you can't accuse these people of is being false, because they knew what they wanted and they went after it. Another Dewey disciple was a man named Harold Rugg, and he wrote the following, which, as I say, reads like a guerrilla manual for the takeover of the nation through the schools. He said, quote, through the schools of the world, we shall disseminate a new conception of government, one that will embrace all of the collective activities of men, one that will postulate the need for scientific control and operation of economic activities in the interests of all people, unquote. So, I don't know, if you're not floored by that kind of stuff, nothing's going to move you. Here's Counts again, if you don't mind me. I just can't believe this stuff. If you want to know what somebody's thinking, you have to go to their original work. Don't go to secondary sources. Counts said, historic capitalism, with its deification of the principle of selfishness, I pause to ask you, was that selfish, what the guy in the gold in the backyard was doing? I mean, we don't know what he was going to do with his profits. Maybe he was going to give them all to charity. But Counts just assumes that historic capitalism deifies the principle of selfishness. It relies on forces of competition, its placing of property above human rights, and its exaltation of the profit motive will either have to be displaced altogether or so radically changed in form and spirit that its identity will be completely lost. And then he says that the teachers should deliberately reach for power and then make the most of their conquest is my firm conviction. To the extent that they are permitted to fashion the curriculum and procedures of the school, get this, they will definitely and positively influence the social attitudes, ideals, and behavior of the coming generation. Now, Dewey was considered a kind of Aristotle by his followers. And he felt that all educational theory was divided by itself, against itself, into traditional and progressive camps. For him, the traditional system was authoritarian, and he insisted, to impose, quote, education, unquote, on the child from without, via memorization, exercises, rote learning, and so on. His cherished progressive brand, in contrast, supposedly focused on the inner child and on the educational process itself. Well, this is pure Rousseau. That's all he's doing is regurgitating what Rousseau was saying. Back again to Dewey. He wanted all teachers, and I think this is an important term, he wanted all teachers to become change agents, quote unquote. By 1971, the U.S. Office of Education had published a manual, get the title of this, by the U.S. Office of Education. Training for Change Agents. That was the name of the manual that they published for the educational establishment in the United States, actually calling a teacher a change agent. And there were 7 volumes of change agent studies developed by the RAND Corporation, which always has its fingers in a lot of this social policy change. These documents explain the psychological techniques that teachers are supposed to use to, quote, freeze and, quote, unfreeze student values. That's what they said. We'll freeze them and unfreeze them, teach them the new stuff. To defuse hostile parent groups, to introduce the science of what they called planned change, unquote, and to deceive the public about learning programs. These manuals were telling them how to deceive the public. If you're traditionally inclined, all this means that teachers were taught how to become subversive. One detailed strategy advocated for change agents was called the Delphi technique, or the Alinsky Method. Now, Saul Alinsky was the guy who was President Obama's teacher when he was a graduate student and taught him all his revolutionary theory. Alinsky himself was a clever rat whose political operations were actually responsible for the bombing deaths of a few people. But the Alinsky method was for manipulating student, parent, or teacher groups into accepting Dewey's philosophy. Anyway, maybe I've told you too much of this, and I'm going to sort of switch now to the psychological connection behind all this. At the time Dewey's influence was making itself felt so strongly in North American educational circles, so too was the influence of experimental psychology. Dewey himself was the pupil of a man named G. Stanley Hall, who, like so many others, was a student himself of the famous Wilhelm Wundt of Leipzig University, who died in 1920. The Wundtians basically preached that man was a biologically determined creature devoid of spirit or of will, whose life was the direct outcome of stimulus-response experiences, and that once understood thoroughly, he could be manipulated through reward and punishment procedures to produce any desired behavior. Thus, for the psychologist, education became the process of exposing the student to meaningful experiences so as to ensure the desired reactions. Oh boy, I say. Here was a scientific method for re-engineering human society, devoid of all that troublesome morality and religion stuff. As I said, it's not simply a matter of 2 + 2 = 4. Before long, a host of laboratory schools, as they called them, devoted to the refinement of these pedagogical methods, had sprung up in North America. And by the time Dewey became head of, get this, Columbia's Teachers College, thousands of public schools existed where, this is a quote from their literature, the Wundtian redefinition of education to mean feeding experiential data to a young brain and to the nervous system rather than the teaching of mental skills led to the abdication of the traditional role of the teacher as an educator. Its place was taken by the concept of the teacher as a guide for the socialization of the child. Dewey called for a leveling of individual differences into a common pool of students who are the object of learning technicians, get it? Learning technicians devising the social order of the future. So this is really what we're talking about now, is the whole psychological aspect of this. Part of this was not being a good person necessarily, but feeling good, and most of all, feeling good about yourself became the key motives of the new psychological man. Self-esteem has become a cover for such outrageous self-confidence. And by the way, I always told my kids as they were growing up, you don't esteem yourself. You gain esteem from others by doing estimable things, estimable acts. That's how you gain esteem from your community. Esteeming yourself is a kind of pride. It used to be called a sin. But meanwhile, self-esteem has become a cover for outrageous self-confidence. The most notorious, I thought, example of this discrepancy between performance and perception when I was doing my book was the 1988 International Math Achievement Test, on which American 13-year-olds, they're only 13, who scored the lowest in the test, it was an international test, had prior to the test given themselves the highest math rating of all the participating nations. Their Japanese and Chinese competitors, who whipped them soundly in math, had all described themselves as only moderately good at math. This phenomenon of national self-deception, encouraged by the public schools, was aptly labeled by the late columnist Charles Krauthammer as doing bad and feeling good. Distressingly, the psychological view sees man as a product of social forces, and the teacher as a therapist who has a duty to alter his product so as to alter society for the better. Marxist organizers, usually operating under more palatable labels such as progressives or reform activists or whatever, or, you know, they're on the community for social change and all that. That's how they smuggle it in. Actually boast that local municipalities and school boards, get this, are the easiest places to get elected to because that's where Canadians are asleep at the helm. I'm quoting them. So this is going back to Gramsci again. You infiltrate the institutions. And the easiest institutions are the schools, especially the public schools where the parents are not in charge. Remember what I said. They're not the paymaster. You know, they can't walk into the principal and threaten to them they're going to withdraw their kids. And the principal goes, oh, my God, we're going to lose another student? What's the problem, ma'am? You know, let me try to fix it. That kind of thing. No, instead of it's, well, we're sorry, you're not happy with the school. I will do our best, and so on. And she leaves. But he's not going to do his best. And he's especially not going to depart from the ideological basis of his thinking in the school. We Canadians, as I say, are not alone in this folly. Mr. Chester Finn, a spokesman for a U.S. program called Total Schooling, said, quote, "We cannot confine ourselves within the boundaries of what is conventionally thought reasonable for public employees to do." What he wanted to do was to have the schools visit and supervise home life and, quote, "be prepared more frequently to remove children from their homes," unquote. The state of Missouri in 1981 began such an interventionist program called Parents as Teachers, or PAT. It's now operating in 40 states and 8 foreign countries on a budget of more than $15 billion back when I wrote this book. It was estimated to rise to $100 billion by 5 years after this. It was truly a cradle-to-grave free schooling system notion, prepaid through taxes, for which evangelical proponents, I'm not saying they were Christians, I'm saying they were speaking like evangelicals, recruit students even in maternity ward nurseries. Dr. Shirley McCune burbles on about this new, quote, strategic direction, unquote, for the American public school, saying that this amounts, I'm quoting her, to a total transformation of our society. Wow. We have moved into a new era, she says. PAT's parent educators who supervise home life are empowered to remove children, discipline parents, and even prescribe drug treatment for children or mandatory courses for parents. The, quote, certified parent educator, unquote, delivers an array of free, so-called free, meaning tax-funded, social services, everything from food to mental health. Yet these educators are responsible to the state and not to the parents. Well, I'm coming to an end here. I personally think all this is incredibly shocking, but, you know, it was all written out. They didn't hide it. We swallowed it. And here we are. And in one of our future talks, I will be talking about how to beat it, how to get the system back to a more privatized schooling system, which I think has proven itself to be successful everywhere it's been tried, but it's been fought hard by public school unions who hate it and who are prepared to shut down all the public schools to stop it from getting in. So that'll be interesting. So I think I've wrapped that up for today, Harry.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The information was very, very important. I learned a lot. Just one question. Everything started in Prussia, right?
Yeah, Wundt, you mean Rockefeller and Wundt, yeah.
So they imported that model of public schooling from Prussia. That's correct.
Did you say Russia? Did you say Russia or Prussia?
Yeah, Prussia.
Yes. Well, there were a lot of these behavioral psychologists operating there. As I say, when I was an undergraduate, I took a degree in psychology. Unfortunately, it was mostly that stuff, which was incredibly boring. It wasn't about real people. It was about dealing with people as if they're animals to be conditioned by psychological experiments. And I hated that. But yeah, there were a lot of Germans or Prussians or whatever back in the day involved in this. And then, of course, there were Americans. I can't remember their names now, but some famous Americans who basically said this. They basically said, we can recondition anybody. You give me a child at a certain age, and I'll make him into whatever you want me to make him into, with stimulus, response, conditioning, and all that kind of stuff. And I remember textbooks which were published like this, or exercise books where they showed you the kind of exercises they would take students through to get them to behave in certain ways and not others. It's just like training a dog.
Mm-hmm. I personally don't hate my daughter enough to send her to school. So
yeah, school. Really, that's a good line. Well, I realize that not everybody can send their child to a private school in a country where this is an added expense. It's very tough. You have to make a lot of sacrifices to do that. And also, private schools have the advantage in the sense that they're appealing to a wealthier class of citizen, necessarily. However, it's also true that many of these private schools have large bursaries and funds to help students who come from poor families to get into the schools, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And there is always the option of homeschooling.
There's the option of homeschooling, and I'll tell you a funny story about that. I have a book fan, I guess you call him a book fan, some years ago, who wrote to me because he wanted to write a novel which leaned on all the principles in my Trouble with Canada book, but were going to be expressed through the characters that he was writing about. And by the by, he told me a story about his kids. Had 3 kids. And I said, what's the story on your kids? He said, oh, well, we homeschool all our kids. And I don't know if you had these over in Europe, but there's a lot of these spelling competitions which are held in the English language because the English language is notoriously dissonant from a spelling point of view from its orthography. For example, if you learn some languages like Japanese, which is a syllabic language, and you learn how to write it in what they call romaji, which are Western letters, anything they say, you can write it out perfectly. You're not going to mistake it. So you couldn't have a spelling competition in Japan. But in the English language, you can, because it's probably the richest language in history. There are lots of historical reasons why that is so. And my dear old professor at Stanford told me once, he said, William, he said, I have a theory, and he was a linguist, a serious linguist. He said every word or stem or root in the French language can be found somewhere in the English language. Mm-hmm. So English has absorbed so many words and vocabulary items from so many other languages. Most of us don't get anywhere close to knowing them all. And the Oxford English Dictionary, which was a massive effort to get a grip on that richness, and an amazing, probably the greatest dictionary in the world, in my opinion. Well, if you go through it, you'll see why they hold spelling bees or spelling competitions in the English language. But this guy said, well, he said, the school boards in our area, he said, were very embarrassed by my daughter. And I said, why? He said, because she won her way onto the stage, went all the way up in these spelling competitions, and she won the most important spelling competition in Canada. And when they asked her what public school she went to, she said, I was homeschooled by my mom and dad. He said, so we have that trophy, he said, and we put it up on the wall. It was a wonderful victory for homeschooling.
That's nice. Okay. Anyway, William, thank you very much. It was a very good presentation as usual. I sent you the previous recording of the show to here in Telegram, and I'm going to send you this one as well in a few minutes. And the last thing I would like, when we are done with the war against the family, maybe you can have 1 or 2 shows on the book of absolutes.
Yes, I would enjoy that. And again, I don't want to tire you or overstay my welcome. So I won't be offended if you fire me.
No way.
And next time I'll sit somewhere else where we won't get the sun and the shadows.
But you look angelic. It's actually good.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, my friend. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah,
I will send you the what?
Thank you. I really enjoy these episodes and being with you and your people.
It's our pleasure. Thank you very much. I will send you the recording in 3 minutes.
Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye-bye.